It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the modern world. We ordinarily date the onset of European modernity sometime around the 17th century. We'll in fact be picking up with modernity in the 18th century with the work of David Hume. When we make this transition from the classical world to the modern world, we're not just making a transition in time. It's not just that the texts that we'll be reading and the people whose views we'll be discussing are nearer to us in time than those we've been heretofore considering. Rather, we're going to be looking at a major transition in modes of thought. As we saw in the classical world, we tended to be thinking about the meaning of life in terms of these big social contexts, and the texts themselves seem to be arrayed in terms of schools of thought. But in modernity, things are going to be different. For one thing, modernity, especially European modernity, is very much conditioned by the rise of science. And the rise of science and the scientific method leads to a skepticism about the importance and the value of tradition. That's going to be important because we'll see an emphasis on individuality and free thinking in modernity that we didn't encounter so much in the classical tradition. And even though some of the skeptical arguments that will animate modernity come from a classical tradition, they will be deployed in very different ways. I emphasize again, because we sometimes get that confused in this area of globalization, that modernity is a culturally specific phenomenon. European modernity, Asian modernity, African modernities may be very different kinds of modernity. We are going to be focusing specifically on European modernity right now, which emerges as science develops on the European continent in the 17th and 18th centuries, and as movements for liberal democracy take root. In the classical world, we saw an emphasis when we talked about human life and the meaning of human life on the social and transcendent dimensions of our lives. That is, the dimensions of our lives that are led in relationship to our cultures and societies, or to some transcendent God, or to the universe. In modernity, that emphasis is going to change, and we'll be focusing instead very much on immanent issues, but more importantly, focusing more on the individual than on the context in which individuals lead their lives. And individualism will emerge as an important hallmark of European modernity. We're picking our discussion up with the work of David Hume, and we're going to track development of modern ideas from David Hume to Immanuel Kant to John Stuart Mill. As we do that, we are going to see a gradual evolution of an idea that underlies most contemporary forms of liberal democracy in Europe, the United States, and many other parts of the world. That is a secularism, a conviction that there's a separation between religious views and public views, and that the public order should not be responsive to a religious order. We'll be watching the evolution of individualism, the idea that the individual is the fundamental unit of analysis, and that individual rights, individual liberties, and individual obligations are paramount duties of a society to respect and to foster. And we will be examining the evolution of the strong public-private distinction that, for instance, animates much of contemporary American culture and political life. The idea that there is a rigid divide between what is in the public domain and available to others and what happens behind closed doors in private. We're going to see that public-private distinction introduced by David Hume, but we're going to see that in Hume's thought, the understanding of our nature as individuals is still developed in terms of our social contexts. But what Hume does do that gets this discussion of publicity and privacy going is that he tosses out this emphasis on the transcendent dimensions of human life in favor of understanding our lives exclusively in terms of our relationships to immanent phenomena. Kant is going to reinforce this public-private distinction. And in Kant, we're going to get the introduction of the importance of the liberty of thought and the liberty of speech. Kant will really emphasize for the first time in European thought and in human thought, really, the importance of autonomy and reason as hallmarks of humanity. And it's the Kantian emphasis on autonomy and reason that become the hallmarks of modernity from a political perspective. And those we will recognize very much as underpinnings of a lot of our contemporary society. John Stuart Mill, as we will see, follows Kant in this emphasis on individual liberty and individual freedom. But Mill develops a far more articulated expression and a far more nuanced expression of the view that our lives and the lives of all of those around us are only meaningful to the extent that we are self-expressive, creative, free individuals, and that the only good society is a society which not only permits this kind of self-expression and freedom, but which encourages it and really draws a clear distinction between the public and the private. So in modernity, as we're going to see, the meaningful life is still a life connected to a social order. But the social order is very different from any social order imagined in any of the antiquities that we've imagined. It's a liberal social order, an individualistic social order, a social order in which the society is constituted by the mutual interaction of individually free, distinct individuals who come together to form a society, rather than a pre-existing society that creates and constructs its individuals. Today, we're going to begin by characterizing in a bit more detail the nature of European modernity, because without understanding the nature of that modernity and the ideological and social forces that drive it, it's very hard to understand how we conceptualize meaningful life in the modern context. We'll talk a little bit about the role of skepticism in the underpinnings of European modernity and what happens to the role of God in human life as modernity takes hold. We will emphasize Hume's very unique position in the European Enlightenment, and in particular, Hume's attack on the traditional role of God as playing a place in the domain of reason and in the public sphere, and Hume's introduction of the idea that belief might be reasonable even if it's not rational, which offers us the beginnings of the underpinning of the private sphere. We begin by talking about the structure of European modernity itself. European modernity is grounded in a divide between science and religion that we can trace very specifically to the Galileo affair. When Galileo really established the heliocentric model of the universe, the idea that the planets revolve around the sun instead of the sun and the planets and the fixed stars revolving around the earth, he was, of course, persecuted by the Catholic Church for a view that was contrary to church dogma. Now, when Galileo was persecuted, it was clear to philosophy as a field that it had to make a choice. Philosophy could cast its lot with science and Galileo or with the church. Fortunately, philosophy made the right choice and threw its lot in with science and Galileo. And so philosophical thinking and political thinking, starting with the Galileo affair, pretty much pushed the church aside as either irrelevant or hostile to the progress of social, scientific, and political thinking. And that divorce shapes the relationship between philosophy and religion and the public and the private spheres ever since Galileo. Because what that does is that it constructs reason and faith not as supporting one another as they did in the Middle Ages and in antiquity, but rather as opposing forces. That faith runs contrary to reason, and reason often takes itself in directions that faith can never countenance. The other piece of this is that it forced an emphasis on the primacy of the individual and the rise of rights. Galileo thought individually. Galileo thought freely. And Galileo and others like him developed the new science that made prosperity, commerce, and politics possible in the modern era. And for that reason, this kind of emphasis on individuality became a very important aspect in European modernity. Another less often appreciated feature of European modernity is this emphasis on the self, the individual, who's now going to become this free locus of value, as a unified thing, a unified subject, and transparent to itself, that we actually know ourselves and our views. We don't need to be told what we think from outside or what we ought to think, but that we are autonomous in that sense. and furthermore, a kind of foundationalism. And the foundationalism is a theory about knowledge. The idea here is that what we know because of our observations in the laboratory or by reasoning. In particular, it is not a foundationalism in Scripture. What we know is under our own control. All of this allows for us to valorize an ideal of progress as opposed to a return to the source. Classically, we think of knowledge as the exegesis of sacred or otherwise authoritative classical texts, and we think of knowledge as developing by a successively better understanding of those original ideas. In modernity, we think of knowledge as arising through progress, through leaving old ideas behind, and developing new ideas as research takes us. One surprising thing, though, about the history of European modernity is that it owes a certain amount of its genesis to the revival of a very classical idea, and that was the Greek idea of skepticism, especially the Pyrrhonian skepticism that was articulated so completely by the 1st or 2nd century philosopher Sextus Empiricus. Because what the Greek skeptics emphasized in their critique of earlier Greek ideas was a rejection of authority as a basis of knowledge, a commitment to reason and to questioning received knowledge, to the primacy of our own experience in our cognitive lives, and to always attempt to undermine or to demand justification for claims that are made, not taking anything on faith. The skepticism played an important methodological role in the scientific method and in the critique of religion that animated early European modernity. Skepticism in science required questioning received dogma, worrying about data, repeating experiments, demanding justification. And skepticism in the critique of religion required asking, do we really have reasons to believe the truth of these scriptures or the truth of these teachings? And if not, what do we do about them? And this revival of classical skepticism, while it appeared to be the revival of one more ancient tradition, in fact was one of the sparks that generated the success of science and the attack on religion that allowed modernity to get a foothold in Europe. Now, God, hence, found himself in a precarious spot as European modernity developed. Modernism rejects the theological as a foundation for knowledge and rejects the Bible and religious scripture as authority. And for that reason, the very existence of God, or at least the importance of God, was held to be threatened by science. The church, in one sense, was right to persecute Galileo, because while you might not think that it's such a big thing to have an alternative model of the solar system, what hangs on that for religion? Why is it so important that we have a heliocentric versus a geocentric model of a solar system? That doesn't seem to be deep theology. What's deep theology is who gets to say, though. And what the church realized in Galileo's work was that science was asserting its own authority as the measure of reality. And the assertion of authority by science meant the undermining of the authority of the church as a measure of reality. For that reason, as I've said, God is now somehow problematic, no longer something that can be taken for granted, because in this new skeptical approach, nothing can be taken for granted. For that reason, God becomes an object who needs proof. His existence requires proof. Reason is getting an upper hand here, but this atheism, the possibility of atheism raises anxiety. It raises anxiety in the church and it raises anxiety in the public. And for that reason, in the early modern period, a kind of small cottage industry develops of articulating proofs for the existence of God. And among the proofs for the existence of God that were developed during this period, or that actually we should say that became popular during this period because they have much older roots, the argument from design became the most popular. And the argument from design was the most popular because it looked like a scientific argument. It looks like an argument that begins by marshaling evidence, arguing from analogy, and giving us a kind of argument to the best explanation. So the argument from design moved to a kind of center stage among those who wanted to defend the existence and importance of God in the modern period. Hume is the person who effectively demolishes that argument. Hume was born in about 1711 and died in 1776. He was a skeptic and was one of the people who was most instrumental in reviving classical skepticism. He was also an atheist, even though he did not publish any of his explicitly atheistic texts during his lifetime. But because of suspicion of his atheism, he was always a kind of outsider to academia. He attempted to secure a university post, but was ruled ineligible because his faith was not sufficiently secure. Nonetheless, Hume had a very active public life. He was a diplomat, a representative of the court of St. James in Paris. He was a very influential historian, and his history of the kings of England was a definitive history for years and years after his death. Hume, like the classical skeptics, liked to use reason to attack the pretensions of reason, so to show that reason itself was self-undermining and forces us to ask very hard questions. Most importantly, I think, it was Hume who introduced the idea of naturalism to philosophy. This is really important for us who are thinking about the meaning of life, because it was Hume who argued that if we want to know what human life is about, if we want to know what we are, we really need to subject ourselves to the methods of science, and that the problem of understanding life and the importance of life is a subpart of the science of human nature. If we understand what kind of beings we are, Hume argued, then we can understand what's good for us. And Hume devoted most of his life to understanding what he called human nature, a kind of proto-psychologist. In part of this enterprise, Hume recognized that we are not entirely rational beings, however much we might pretend, say as an Aristotelian would think, that what's distinctive about us is our reason. Hume argued that every bit as important as our reason, maybe more important, are our passions, that is our emotional life, and our imagination. And it's central to Hume's thinking that a meaningful and a good human life is a life in which the passions and the imagination have a central role as well as reason. The question is now, how did Hume succeed so dramatically in banishing God from the domain of reason and making this massive move to distinguish the private sphere of religion from the public sphere of political life and rational debate? He did it, as I said, by refuting the argument from design and refuting it decisively. How does the argument from design go? Well, in brief, it's like this. We look at the universe, and it's full of very complex phenomena that just seem designed perfectly to fulfill their functions. For instance, if we look at our eyes, they're so well designed for seeing things. Our ears are so well designed for hearing things. Our legs are really good at walking. And if you look around the universe, you see all these things that fulfill their functions really well. Remember, we're long before Darwin right now. Normally, the proponent of the argument of design continues, when we see a complex object designed perfectly to fulfill a function, we assume that it was created by an intelligent designer. So the classic argument that you always see and that Hume quotes in his own dialogues on natural religion, if you're walking down a beach and you run across a watch and you pick it up and it's ticking and it's working and it tells time beautifully and it tells the day of the week and so forth, you don't assume that the watch developed naturally as an organic object out of sand. You assume that because it's so intricate and so well designed for a particular function, that it was designed by an intelligent designer. So the argument concludes, since so many things in the universe, and indeed if we get rhapsodic enough, we say the universe as a whole seems so intricate, its parts fit so well together, it must have been designed by an intelligent designer. Now notice that this argument becomes really important in the context of modernity, because it looks like the last bulwark against atheism. It keeps God in the picture. And if you thought that what makes a human life significant and important is a relationship to God, and you also think that science is a really good thing, and you don't want to go the way of the church and persecute Galileo, you want to allow science to continue, then you want some way of using science to defend the existence of God, and the argument from design looks tailor-made for the purpose. Hume, nonetheless, demolishes it. Hume points out several things. First, he says, it is seriously non-probative. That is, it does not get its conclusion. For one thing, he points out, there are big disanalogies between universes and artifacts. I mean, we notice that. Most artifacts, we've seen them get designed. They're relatively small. They're relatively temporary. Worlds are big. We've never seen them get designed. And Hume points out that when you get big differences between phenomena, arguments from analogy no longer work. His analogy is very nice. He says, look, if I see a sheep and I notice that its heart pumps its blood, and I look at a dog and notice that its blood is circulating, I infer that there must be a heart, because dogs and sheep are relevantly similar. But if I were to look at a tree and see that its sap circulates and conclude on the analogy of the mammal that the tree must have a heart, then I argue fallaciously, because the disanalogies between animals and trees are sufficient that an argument from analogy won't go through. Similarly, Hume points out there's an even greater disanalogy between the artifacts we observe and whole universes, and so that argument doesn't get any purchase. Moreover, Hume says, when you get arguments by analogy like this, inductive arguments going, they gain their strength from many instances. It's not just that sheep and dogs have hearts, but cats have hearts, and cows have hearts, and wolves have hearts, and so forth. So you need many instances to make the arguments look good. But Hume asks the proponent of the argument from design, how many worlds have you seen created? How many worlds have you seen designed? It's not as though we have a kind of inductive argument that says, oh, that world was designed, that world was designed, that world was designed, so this world must be designed. We have a unique case, and arguments for analogy don't work in such cases. Moreover, Hume points out, if we like the analogy, it's really not a very good one for the argument from design. Because if we look at really complex things that we know and love in our world, the most complex things, the things we can't even create, like animals or vegetables or plants or flowers, they grow naturally through biological reproduction. So if the argument is that the world as a whole must be created in the same way that these complex organs and animals are, we should expect that the world is not designed by an intelligent creator, but that it grows by organic biological development. And that doesn't prove that there is a God. That seems to prove that there isn't one. That's a problem. So for these reasons, Hume argued, the argument from design doesn't get its conclusion. But he went further. He argued that the argument from design, if it proves anything, proves way too much. Why? Well, if you look at the world, maybe it's designed, but it's not all that well designed. Think about how many people you know who have needed knee replacements or hip replacements, or who have been born with disabilities. Think about all of the floods and earthquakes and things that go wrong. If the world was designed, Hume points out, it seems to have been designed by maybe as a rough draft, he says, maybe the rude essay of an infant deity. It seems to have been designed by an amateur god, not a god we'd actually want to worship or care about. Moreover, Hume points out, suppose it is designed. What do we know about really complex things that are designed? Bridges, airplanes, cities. Hume, of course, didn't mention airplanes. I'm mentioning airplanes. They weren't around yet. Most of them aren't designed by a single designer, but by a committee. So if the world is really as complex as the proponent of the argument suggests, we ought to conclude that it was designed not by a single dumb god, but by a committee of dumb gods, which is not what the theist wants after all. Finally, Hume points out, if we also think that it was designed, then if we think that the world is designed because it's similar to other artifacts we've seen designed, then we ought to think that its designer is similar to the designers with which we are familiar. But who are the designers with which you're familiar? Architects, engineers, landscape designers, and so forth. They are all mortal, finite, deficient human beings. So we should conclude that if there's somebody who designed the universe, A, there's a bunch of them working together, B, they're mortal, finite, and deficient, and C, they're rather dumb. So it doesn't appear, Hume thinks, that the argument from design is anything we can rest on. And of course, that's problematic. Because if we thought that in the context of science, the only argument that was going to convince us that there really is a God is this argument from design, that is a scientific argument, we seem to be bereft. And notice this isn't peculiar to the 17th and 18th century, because right now, when we examine people who still try to prove that God exists in the context of science, the so-called fine-tuning argument, which is just a rehash of the argument from design, is the most common argument trotted out to try to prove the existence of God. Always we think we don't want to go outside of science. We as modernists accept the authority of science and hope that it itself will give us God. And what Hume showed was there's not much of a possibility. But Hume pointed out there's a twist. There's something very deep that we can learn from the argument from design and from its failure and from the drive to prove the existence of God. And it's this twist that really forms the foundation for so much of our ideology of modernity, even though many people don't notice this. Hume points out that the proponent of the argument from design, as I've said several times, supposes that reason is the only reasonable basis for belief. That is, the proponent of the argument seems to agree with the atheist that we should only believe that God exists if we've got good reason to do so. The only difference is the atheist thinks there isn't any, and the proponent of the argument from design falsely thinks there is. But Hume argues that many of our most important beliefs, the beliefs that really animate our lives and make it possible for us to lead lives in the first place, and as we'll see next time, he includes among these beliefs in the external world, beliefs in the regularity of nature, even the belief in the utility of reason itself, aren't rational themselves. They're not based on reason. Let's think about that for a moment. If somebody actually questioned the existence of the external world, and it was your job to convince this mad person that the world outside of themselves really does exist, how could you do it? You couldn't do it using reason. Why? You'd have to marshal some evidence. And any evidence you provided for the existence of the external world is going to be denied by the person you're trying to convince, because she doesn't believe that there is any evidence in the first place. Suppose you were trying to prove to somebody that reason is a rational thing to use. Now remember, she is denying that reason is rational. What kinds of reasons could you possibly motivate, could you possibly mobilize to convince her? None at all, because any would simply beg the question. So Hume points out that wherever our faith comes from, and it's a real faith, and you notice that every time you reach out for something, every time you take a step, every time you speak to somebody else, our faith in the existence of the world beyond ourselves, our faith in the regularity of nature, that the sun is going to rise in the east and set in the west tomorrow, just like it always has, rather than reverse those two. Again, what's your reason for believing that? He argues that all of these are based in our instincts, in our passions, in our emotional life, and in our conventions. But for that reason, he argues, they're not unreasonable, that it is simply reasonable for us to pay attention to and to heed our own nature. And it's part of our own nature to trust our senses. It's part of our own nature to trust reason. It's part of our own nature to interact with each other. And so Hume argues that our passions and our conventions may lead us to beliefs and to practices that are totally reasonable. These are important parts of ourselves, even if not rational. Maybe like that for theism, Hume pointed out. So theism, Hume argued, may not be susceptible of proof. That's right. The argument from design doesn't work, but it doesn't follow from that that it's unreasonable. Because theism, he argued, might not even demand proof. Theism might be one of those things that's an option for you. I mean, for instance, suppose you tell me that you love chocolate ice cream and I love vanilla ice cream. You don't need to prove to me that chocolate ice cream is good in order to eat it. I don't need to prove to you that vanilla ice cream is good in order to eat it. Such things aren't demanding of proof, which is good because they're not susceptible of proof. It's still reasonable for you to eat chocolate ice cream, reasonable for me to eat vanilla ice cream, even though neither of us can provide arguments justifying our taste to the other. So Hume pointed out, theism might be reasonable, but not rational. If theism is reasonable than not rational, then religion, faith, and maybe a whole host of other things can be relegated to the realm of the private sphere, areas of private choice, things about which reasonable people might disagree, but about which they don't need to argue. Whereas we can leave what is rationally adjudicable in the public sphere, things that we can actually talk about, reason about, and that way we can begin to construct our public lives in a way that allows us to find one kind of meaning in one sphere and a different kind of meaning in another. Notice that this is a kind of curious Jobian twist on modernity. This is one of the reasons I love Hume so much. He's always slightly different from everybody else. That is, like Job, Hume is saying, God may not be accessible to reason, but the fact that he's not accessible to reason need not matter to us. We can choose to have a theological life and a relationship to religion if we want. We can choose not to if we want, but we don't need to provide arguments or reasons like Job's friends in order to make our religious life make sense. So here we begin to introduce this fundamental idea that animates so much of our lives today and so much of how we think about what it is to lead a good life, this distinction between the public and the private. But of course, if we lead a life without God and a life where reason isn't self-justifying, we still need to ask a question. How does that life make sense? What's significant about it? How can we make our lives appear meaningful after faith in God ceases to be the object of reason? That's the big project for European modernity. That's the project that Hume begins to take up and that Kant and Mill inherit from him. And it's that project to which we're going to turn in our next lecture, examining where Hume goes from here. And there we're going to get textual again, looking at Hume's own words. Please join me for that discussion.